Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. We have a very exciting session on eco conservation coming up with a special focus on India's flooded forests. Now, we have Priya Ranganathan, a landscape ecologist and doctoral researcher at the Ashoka Trust for Research in Ecology and the Environment in Bengaluru. Her research explores the ecohydrology, biodiversity, and restoration of endangered freshwater swamps off of the central Western Ghats. She's particularly interested in understanding how ecological research can inform practical conservation and ecosystem restoration. Beyond her research, Priya is passionate about making conservation science engaging and accessible to wider audiences. She has written more than 60 popular science articles and founded the digital children's magazine Youth for Nature to bring stories of India's wildlife and ecosystems to the youth. And beyond this, in 2023, she received the M. Krishnan Nature Writing Award for Excellence in Nature Writing. In 2025, she was named a finalist for the Future for Nature Award in recognition of her conservation work. She also teaches science communication to postgraduate students and enjoys using storytelling and the arts to help people discover and connect with India's lesser known ecosystems. And this session is called The Secret Life of India's Flooded Forests. So at this point, let's hand it over and welcome Priya Ranganathan to take us through the rest.
Thank you so much, Aisha, for that lovely welcome. And I'm so happy to be here and looking forward to talking to all of you about a topic that's very close to my heart and something I've now invested 4 years in, still going on, which is my doctoral research on India's rarest ecosystem and her flooded forests. Great. All right. So when we talk about India's natural wonders, we think of tigers, elephants, mangroves, maybe, or even the Himalayas. But hidden deep within the Western Ghats is an ecosystem that almost nobody has heard of. These flooded forests that you see in front of you have been quietly storing water, supporting wildlife, and helping our rivers flow for millions of years. And today I'd like to introduce you to them. So, what exactly is the secret behind these forests? Why are they flooded? Why do we call them flooded forests? And what makes them so very important, both ecologically as well as to people? Not just to the people who live near them, but to you, everyone sitting at home watching this webinar right now. So, this is what I first saw in 2019 when I set foot in a flooded forest. So, take a really good look at what you see in front of you. Have you ever seen a forest growing in water? Because most people haven't. When we think of forests, we imagine dry ground beneath our feet. We picture teak forests, evergreen forests, or maybe forests where tigers, elephants, or gaur live. And we sometimes imagine safaris that trundle through national parks, or even forests from other countries, which we now see on National Geographic or on planet Earth. But this forest is very different. Could I please have the video? This is a swamp forest. Here, trees aren't simply growing next to the water, they grow in the water. For most of the year, the forest floor remains flooded. If you walk through this forest, as I did so very many times, you'd probably have wet feet within minutes. Look closely in the video. The water isn't just one or two puddles after a heavy rain. It's woven throughout the forest, tiny rivulets that move among these roots. So, this immediately raises a lot of questions. How do the trees survive? What kind of animals and birds live here? Where does all this water come from and how does it stay? And perhaps the most important question of all, why have so few people actually heard of these forests? So, this actually is what I see every time I step into a forest, a flooded forest. And these forests are more than just forests, they're actually wetlands. So, how many of you have heard of wetlands? I'm sure it's a buzzword these days. So, wetlands are actually ecosystems that straddle land and water, just like the Myristica swamps, which I just introduced you to. So these are freshwater swamp forests. and they're found only in the Western Ghats, nowhere else in the world. And they remain flooded, as you saw, for most of the year. So you can expect even the driest of dry seasons to find at least a little bit of water in them. So, unlike many forests that dry out after the rains, even throughout the year, you are going to find water here, as I just mentioned. So, water isn't really an accident over here. It's the reason that the entire ecosystem actually exists. These forests occur in shallow valleys where water naturally collects. So, rainfall, springs, groundwater, and the shape of the land work together to channel all the water, both above the ground and below the ground, into this one area, this swamp. And it keeps the soil saturated throughout the year. So, imagine a sponge. Water seeps into the sponge and the sponge holds it there, right? When you squish the sponge, water oozes out. Similarly, over here, when you squish the soil, when your feet step on the soil, water oozes out. Over thousands of years, the plants and animals here have adapted to these permanently wet conditions. And once you have water year round, something remarkable happens. The trees begin to change, their roots change, and the animals that can survive here end up being different than those in the surrounding forests. So, in other words, water creates an entirely different world. So, what makes a flooded forest and why are they so very rare? Well, location matters. So, these forests actually occur in the shallow river valleys where water naturally collects. We find that over thousands of years, water has been retained in these landscapes due to heavy rainfall, and that's because of the Western Ghats of India. So I'll just go back here to this picture. This is the Western Ghats. And you can see tiny blue dots, right, on this map. Well, those are actually the locations where swamps exist today. These swamps used to once occur along all the small streams in the river valleys that were found throughout the Western Ghats, all the way from Maharashtra down to Kerala. But today they're only found in tiny fragmented pockets. A few here in Maharashtra and Goa, a larger collection in the Western Ghats of Karnataka, and then another set in Kerala and Tamil Nadu. But why are they occurring in only these small, tiny patches? Well, that's actually due to the evolution of this landscape. These forests are relics of the past. These are the original forests of the Western Ghats that occurred when India broke off from Madagascar and actually drifted to its current location attached to the Eurasian plate. So, what happened is there was a lot of intensive volcanic activity, and this caused the Western Ghats uplifting, the rise of these mountains, right? These gently sloping hills. And along with that, water also suddenly started to move in a different way. There were hills where there was once flat land, and so the water started to move downwards. And where water moves downwards, it starts to collect, as we mentioned, like a sponge. So along all of these complex rivers, there were tiny, tiny streams that grew, and along these tiny streams grew ancient forests. Then eventually, people began to colonize these forests, as people tend to do. And when people colonized the Western Ghats, they started to first have a shifting lifestyle, a nomadic lifestyle, where they harvested in one place, then they moved on, they harvested in another patch of forest. Some patches of forest were actually flooded at the time, like Myristica swamps. These were the original Myristica swamps of the region. And in these patches of forest, people worshipped and they actually thought that because there's so much water present here and because so many animals live here, this patch of forest is protected. It gives us so much. It gives us bounty. It gives us forest products to eat. It gives us timber that we can use. It gives us water year round for us to drink. And it gives us wildlife to hunt. And therefore, we are going to worship in these forests. These were the original sacred temples of India, these forests. So people worshipped in these patches of forest, and eventually the protocol became that sorry, people would actually keep these forests with these huge trees, the one you see in front of you, intact, and cut down other patches of forest to develop agriculture. So, plantations, subsistence farming for their daily life, all of this evolved in the forests of the Western Ghats, creating the landscape we see today, where there's paddy fields, there are plantations, and then there are forests, right? It's a very multi use landscape now. But these patches of flooded forest remained intact because people respected nature and they respected what nature gave to them, which is a topic we're going to touch on later as to one of the reasons these swamps still remain relevant today. So, when this happened, people would be very careful to not cut down the trees in these swamps. And thus, these ancient trees survived here and nowhere else. They faded out elsewhere in the Western Ghats, but they remained here in these swamps. So, life as a result in these flooded forests had to take on very unique forms, as we've mentioned, and as you saw in that video. So, there are two species of trees that I really want to touch on, and these are the swamp trees. And they're not just any trees, they are the nutmeg trees. So, I'm sure many of you have heard of biryani and eaten and loved biryani. And one of the key ingredients in biryani is nutmeg, which is a spice. And nutmeg is right in front of you here in these Myristica swamps. These are the wild nutmeg and the Canara nutmeg, named after Uttar Kannada, the district where I study swamps, and they are also found. So remember, the plants that live in these flooded forests have to have different ways to survive, which most trees that are found in dry forests don't need. So look at the wild nutmeg, for example, on the right. At first glance, it looks normal, but then look at its roots. Instead of growing straight into the ground like the roots of any tree you might see in the city, the roots have to spread out like stilts. So imagine trying to stand in soft mud after a heavy rainfall. You'd probably sink. These roots, these stilt roots, help anchor the tree in permanently waterlogged soils. So even when the ground is soft and shifting on with all the relentless water, the tree remains stable. This tree is also extremely rare. There are about 1,500 mature trees remaining in the wild, and they are only found in these freshwater swamps. The tree next to it, the Canada nutmeg, is a close relative, and it also has a fascinating adaptation. When the soil is flooded, there's very little water underground, very little oxygen, excuse me, underground. So the Canada nutmeg produces special roots called knee roots that stick up above the surface, which allow it to take in air, almost like a snorkel. And you'll see in this tiny zoomed in picture that the roots actually have little pores, little dots on them. Just like our skin has pores to allow for air exchange, gas exchange. Same thing happens here. These are the nostrils of the plant. They're called lenticels, which is a really technical way of just saying pores. So they're propped up above the water surface, so oxygen and carbon dioxide can freely be exchanged with the environment. And it's not just the trees that have evolved. A lot of rare and endemic species, which are species that are found nowhere else on Earth or nowhere else in India at least, are found here. So take the Malabar grey hornbill, which is in the top left corner. This bird is found across the Western Ghats in the dense wet evergreen forest, the tropical rainforest that we hear about. This species is one of the reasons that Myristica swamps continue to exist today. So, along with other species like the lion-tailed macaque that you see on the right, which is the monkey, the primate species, hornbills actually play an important role in dispersing or making sure that the seeds of this myristica tree move on to other patches of forest, which allows these swamps to regenerate and grow in different places. It actually keeps the species alive. So hornbills, how do they do this? It's a funny little story, and I noticed this one day when I was observing the wildlife of swamps. So hornbills actually will pluck the fruit, and the fruit of the myristica tree, inside it has a seed, and the seed is covered with this nice red, juicy, fleshy covering, which is bright red in color. So red in nature is a signal to wildlife, and especially to birds, it signals that something tasty to eat. And so hornbills actually will eat the fleshy outer covering of the seed. And in the process, they crack the seed because they have to throw and catch the seed repeatedly to crack it within their beaks to peel off that outer fleshy covering. So the seed cracks and the seed is dropped down to the forest floor. It's not eaten. When it drops to the forest floor, you have crabs, a second piece of this puzzle. And the crabs scurry over, grab these seeds, and take them and bury them in this flooded soil. Why does this matter? Well, Myristica seeds actually have this amazing capacity to not regenerate. They don't shoot, the shoots don't appear unless the soil is flooded and wet and conditions are optimal for the tree, which is swamp, evolved in the swamp, to survive. So what happens once it's this cracked seed is buried in the soil? If it's a year with great rain, there's good monsoon rainfall, the soil is moist and wet, a tiny shoot begins to appear, and the next cycle of life continues. If it's a poor rainfall year, like we've had in the past, recent past, this actually you will not find any seeds germinating. The shoots remain within the seed. The seed lies essentially dormant in the soil, waiting for optimal conditions, waiting for water to come back and revive it. So, this is one of the really nice ways in which many species work together to help this tree survive and grow in this unique ecosystem. You also find other amazing species there. There are lots of damselflies, which you can see in the center picture at the top. They're beautiful winged creatures, and these are actually extremely sensitive to tiny changes in the environment. So, one of the ways that I can tell if a Myristica swamp is healthy or not doing so well is actually by looking for these odonats, for these damselflies. If you see certain species of damselflies that are found in these nice, healthy swamps, you know the swamp is doing well. But if you see other species, you know that there's a problem. Maybe the water quality isn't good. Maybe the swamp is being cut down. Maybe the land around the swamp is changing too rapidly. And thus, these really sensitive species don't survive here. The same can be said for this really unique frog that's found in Myristica swamps. And I really want to draw attention to it because of its name. It's called the dancing frog. So, dancing frogs actually do dance. It's not just a frivolous name. What they do is they are swamp breeders just after the monsoon rain. So, imagine you're a really tiny frog and you live on the rocks just beside or within this stream that's moving through the Myristica swamp. Well, during the monsoon, the rain is so incessant and so loud for you as a tiny little creature that you can't really be heard. No matter how loudly you croak, you can't be heard. So these swamps derive a really nice way of making sure they attract a mate. They pick up their hind leg and they wave it in a circular motion as if it's an elaborate dance move. And this is why it's got its name, the dancing frog. A female frog sitting somewhere else, maybe across the stream, who couldn't have possibly heard the male frog croak, sees this movement and knows, hey, that's a male frog, and he's ready to mate. And they can, and then as a result, there is the scope for this species to actually breed and reproduce its population. So it's a really nice small story of how species have evolved with their environment, not just the trees, but also the wildlife. Some animals like the macaques, like the hornbills, help shape the swamps. And some animals' behavior, like the dancing frog, is shaped by the swamp. But what I really was interested in, because there are so many people who are wonderful ecologists and study the biodiversity in great detail in these swamps, and those were some of the first studies on swamps. But what really interested me was thinking about why these forests matter and how can we make a better case for their conservation, because they are very, very rare. And unfortunately, as many hidden ecosystems, lesser known ecosystems have this problem, they're not very charismatic. They're not like tigers, they're not flashy, right? Many smaller species in the forest are often forgotten because the tiger takes up most of the attention. Similarly, there are so many wonderful forests around the world that get attention. There are tiny little Myristica swamps that are only found in these tiny pockets of the Western Ghats, mostly not even known by the people who live there. They also slip away from people's focus and attention. So that was one of the things I really wanted to do. I wanted to understand how people have relate to these ecosystems. How was it in the past, and what does today's generation really think about swamps? And that shaped a good part of my research because I really wanted to know, like, do people get involved with these swamp forests? Do they still worship here, as you can see in this image? Do they still derive ecosystem services or benefits from nature? And in turn, do these impact the swamp, maybe negatively or maybe positively? So that shaped the next leg of my work. So I talked to a lot of people who lived around swamps, some who interacted daily with them, some who interacted rarely with them, and some who had no idea they existed. And some of the main reasons people even knew about swamps and valued them in this landscape were that they gave them clean water for household use. And I'm going to touch on why swamps give clean water in the next slide or in one or two slides. They also gave medicinal plants. Just like the nutmeg tree is a spice, there are also a lot of plants that grow in this understory or in the lower levels of the forest that are medicinal. And they've been traditionally used by people in these communities instead of allopathic medications. There are also forest and aquatic food sources found in here: fish, crabs, seeds, leaves, berries, and they're all harvested by local people to eat and to create traditional dishes. Swamps were also really flagged as an important reason that houses downstream don't flood. So I live in Bangalore, and in Bangalore, we have an issue every monsoon of consistent flooding. Why? Because we have a lot of lakes. And as the rainwater comes in, the lakes don't really have a buffer around them. They don't really have a region around them that can absorb, act like a sponge and hold water. What happens? The water essentially rises to the top of the lake and spills over onto the edges, which is where people live. There are tall apartment buildings everywhere around lakes these days. And thus, we find that flooding is rampant and there are lots of infrastructural issues and lot of hassles to people's lives just because of flooding. Out here in Uttar Kannada, where I work, people actually don't have complaints about flooding. And why? Because these Myristica swamps that are intact are doing their job. They're actually maintaining, I'm so sorry, they're actually maintaining that lovely sponge like quality that allows the water that comes in a flood to stay there and not wash downstream and wash away people's plantations or homes. These swamps also cool the air temperature. Imagine a dense forest feels much cooler than the hot city. And these swamps, being oldest forests out there, have really towering tall trees. And the trees grow so close together that sunlight doesn't penetrate through to the forest floor. They are dark inside, dark forests. And as a result, people actually find that living next to them means that the air temperature is cool. It's a lovely climate to live in. They also replenish the groundwater, and the same sponge like texture that I talked about allows water to soak from the rain down and stay within the soil. Additionally, swamps are often seen as a potential for tourism, ecotourism, and recreation. And the Karnataka Forest Department has made great steps in trying to open up a few swamps to through the public through ecotourism ventures. So local people told us that they've actually benefited immensely from this because they're able to. There are more tourists coming through who may stop by at their restaurants or small scale hotels or stay at their homestays because they want to go and visit these rare swamps. Additionally, many of these swamps are sacred. And I had showed you a picture just previously of people worshipping Chaudamma, the water goddess, inside a Myristica swamp. And this was one of the most interesting aspects of my research. I actually, as a long-time researcher in the landscape, was invited to attend a Diwali celebration in a swamp a couple of years ago. And this is footage from that. So traditionally, women do not enter the core intact area of the swamp where the puja is actually completed. And so we stood a little bit on the edge and we watched as they made offerings to the gods. And the gods are typically worshipped as small stone statues at the bases of these trees. So it's a really lovely way of showing respect for nature and for nature's bounty. And that's one of the reasons I really fell in love with this landscape because here people have a very mutualistic interaction with swamps. They derive things from swamps, but they also try to give respect and they try to give space for these swamps to survive even as the landscape around them is always changing. So that does bring us to the question of what does keep these forests alive. So, what allows a flooded forest to remain flooded? I've talked to you a lot about how they act as sponges, but I wanted to quickly go into why this happens. And the reason you'll see why this also leads to us saying that swamps prevent flooding and they replenish the groundwater. So, without making this a very technical aspect, so when the rain falls during the monsoon or any other time of the year, it collects in the higher hills of this landscape and rolls down the landscape either through streams, rivers, or just through the soil itself, either above or below the soil. And it all collects in the lower bowls. Think of a nice bowl, right? Water flows through the sides of the bowl and into the bowl itself, collecting. So that's what a swamp is. It's the bowl in the landscape. It's lying low, able to collect all the water that comes in. Once the water collects in the swamp, it doesn't just stay on the surface. It starts to slowly trickle through the pores in the soil underground. And below the ground is what we call an aquifer or the water table. It is literally a plate of water right below this bowl supporting it. Think of a bowl on a table. Well, in a swamp, actually, the water table and the bowl interact very closely. In many other wetlands, you'll have a bowl, you have space, and then you have the table. Here, the water and the bowl, water table and the swamp itself, the soil of the swamp, are continuously giving water back and forth to one another. It's a continuous back and forth process. So now in the monsoon, obviously, these swamps are full of water because there's an excess. The water soil is filled to its absolute maximum. The sponge can't hold any more water. So the water oozes out to the surface and you see water consistently throughout all the roots. But what happens in the dry season, which is actually most interesting? The rain has gone. It's been maybe 4 or 5 months since the last rainfall, and everywhere else in the landscape is dry. However, in Myristica swamps, because the groundwater table is so full of water from the monsoon, it says, wait, I can push the water right back up to the surface to replenish the water that is no longer seen there, that's not coming from the rain. So even when the surrounding forests are dry, we find that the surface of Myristica swamps around these trees still holds water. Now, I don't want to discount the role of these trees in holding this water as well, because those little knee roots that we saw that belong to the trees, right, and the stilt roots that kept it above the water, they also play another really important role. They slow the flow of water that enters the swamp. So imagine you've got a raging river, it's moving really fast. It has the capacity to just wash through and move downstream, right, causing destruction in its way. Now, if water is moving so fast, it doesn't have a chance to pause and settle and seep into the soil. So, these hook like roots of the swamp prevent that water from gathering speed and moving downstream. It slows the water. Think of trying to drive your car through a barricade. You wind left, you wind right, and as a result, you have to drive really slowly. You can't just whiz through like you would on a highway. Similarly, over here, the water has to slow because it's going through these roots, around these roots, and it's spreading out because it's trying to find a path through. In the process, it slows down dramatically. So the stream flowing into the swamp is much faster than the water in the swamp itself. Now that the water has slowed, the roots are able to actually keep the soil together, keep a grip on the soil, and the soil can start to do its job and absorb the water. That's why so much water stays in a swamp. Of course, excess water continues downstream. And even during the dry season, because water comes up from the soil, there is always water moving out of the swamp. And this benefits the people and the wildlife that live just downstream of the swamp, just outside of the swamp. This is just examples of the kind of work I've been doing in this landscape to try and understand the process I just explained to you. So we look at the water quality in swamps, and the reason I'm looking at the water quality is I want to understand what do these swamps actually help remove the impurities that are coming from the water upstream, because they do this thing of slowing down the water and capturing it and holding it in the soil. So, why might a swamp actually help improve water quality? Well, again, by slowing the flow of water, it acts like a sieve. All the pollutants and particles or pesticides and fertilizers from plantations upstream slow and get settled down to the bottom, and the clean water remains on the top and continues downstream, which benefits the people who live there. So, a healthy, functioning swamp is actually supposed to do this. It's supposed to settle down all the pollutants and nutrients and let the clean water go downstream. So, I wanted to understand, are these swamps in this landscape actually healthy? And are they doing this job properly? Because it directly impacts the health of the people who live downstream. I'm also studying the soil, as you can see in one of the pictures, because it's really important to understand what properties of this soil allow it to hold water and how deep is the water table actually here. How much water do we even have? So that if we have a really poor rainfall year, is there still going to be water available for people to survive the dry season and for their crops downstream that depend on this water leaving a Myristica swamp for irrigation? Are those crops going to survive a dry year as well? So that's one of the reasons I'm studying the soil. I'm also here measuring the streams because it's really important to understand what is the quantity of water that enters a swamp and how much leaves it. This is important for two reasons. One, if too much water is leaving the swamp and there's not enough left in the swamp for the trees themselves, that next generation of trees is not going to grow because the seeds won't germinate. However, if not enough water is leaving and going downstream, people are going to put pipes that come from the swamp taking water out. And again, we're going to have an issue of maybe an imbalance of water extraction. Too much water is going to be removed. And again, we're going to have issues for the species that live in swamps. So it's really important to understand what is the volume of water entering and thus leaving a swamp to understand how people downstream may be able to continue sustainably harvesting water, sustainably taking water from the swamp in a way that allows the native species to also survive. As I mentioned just now, there is unfortunately another issue that has to do with people depending so closely to swamps. And that's unfortunately that land use change or the way that people have evolved the land, have been shaping the landscape around these forests has really played a big role in the reason that they're disappearing so rapidly. So if you can see the picture in front of you, there's dense rainforest in the background and there's cropland in the foreground. Every time I have entered a swamp in this landscape, almost inevitably there's going to be a plantation either just upstream of the swamp or just downstream of a swamp. Or maybe there's going to be a road that passes just next to the swamp. So why does this really matter? So here are some examples of the kinds of changes that humans have done to these ecosystems. While ecotourism definitely benefits a swamp, creating trails in the forest can also open them up to more footfall. More people are now curiously entering. Or even if they're not really curious, more people can enter and litter in the landscape, right? So, opening up the forest to ecotourism also has the problem of opening up the forest to litter and pollutants that were otherwise not present. Secondly, we have a lot more roadway connectivity across India, including in areas that were once entirely forest. And of course, roads are critical. They connect people from place to place. Unfortunately, when you have roads that run right beside streams and rivers, we often have roads right beside these Myristica swamps. So, in the monsoon, water washes pollutants from the road. Think of petrol that's spilled, think of pollutants, think of litter that people throw out of their cars as they're driving. All of this is washed into the swamp itself. And actually, pollutants that are released from the roads can severely impact the health of the species that are in the swamps as well as the quality of the water. So, people who live down the stream of these swamps are often drinking water that's much more polluted than it should be. Another reason that swamps are very threatened in Uttar Kannada, especially where I work, is because of direct extraction of water for irrigation and domestic use. So what we see is that in many houses they have immense areca nut or supari plantations just next to the swamp forest. Why? Areca is a really water intensive crop, and areca requires, that means it requires irrigation throughout the year and irrigation to the extent of flooding the plantation itself. So in order to maintain this level of irrigation, just depending upon the stream that leaves the swamp is insufficient. Many farmers actually end up cutting trees, swamp trees, and encroaching or creating their plantations within swamps, right next to a swamp. Slowly becomes within the swamp, and soon the swamp disappears and becomes a plantation. And why is this? Well, people want a source of water throughout the year. And reliably, if there is a swamp with water present throughout the year, that area is going to be excellent for growing areca. So the immense pressure to create this cash crop and to sell it on the market has also inevitably led to a decline in Myristica swamps across the landscape because of this heavy pressure from the market pressure and commercial pressure that's risen up in this landscape. We also see that people thus are setting a lot of pipes through the forest from the swamps out into their plantations or their houses to supplement the water they would be getting from the stream. Here's a lovely aerial photograph of the landscape in which I work, and I've put a red marker right at a Myristica swamp that I have been studying for the past 4 years. And as you can see, right next to it is a dense light green patch. looks like forest. It's really not. That's an areca nut plantation. These vast, beautiful plantations look like forests. They look like they're keeping nature in natural spaces. They look like trees, and many people, we see trees and we think, well, that's great. We're planting trees, we're keeping the forest intact. But the type of forest matters. These are wet evergreen jungles. They're very different from a plantation, which is a calculated, planted set of trees, right? The trees that are planted in a plantation are for commercial growth, purposes. They're grown for a purpose. They're not the natural trees that live in this landscape. So that's why it's really problematic, ecologically speaking, to have these plantations growing up right next to our swamps. Of course, progress happens. Of course, people need a source of livelihood, and many farmers in this landscape are also the ones who worship their gods within the swamps. So that's a really complicated trade off that has emerged through my research of livelihoods and livelihood security, as well, versus retaining natural forests, retaining these ancient forests that are also sacred to people, that also provide them with bountiful resources throughout the year. And many people have realized this trade off. They've realized that while the same forest that supports their plantations is this forest that they're cutting down to expand the plantations. So it's well known, it's not an unknown fact to the locals. But at the same time, it's a fact that we as researchers have to flag as, a very strange situation that's coming up of, well, we cannot tell people what to do. We cannot tell people how to use their natural landscapes, right? We can't tell people this is wrong and this is right, because we don't live their lives. We don't live the nuances of their day-to-day lives. We don't know what's a bad crop year, a good crop year, and what that looks like for their lifestyle. And so it's really hard as a researcher who's interested in conserving swamps, not just understanding them, to go into this landscape and not tell people, hey, your plantation is the reason this swamp is finding it really hard to exist. And as someone who cares about swamps, I'm concerned about this. Which, of course, brings us to the question of how can we save them? And this is the very last portion of my talk with you today. So we've been developing, our team at Atri has been developing a roadmap to restoration of Myristica swamps. Because it's not just a clear-cut solution. Restoration in many parts of India has been framed as planting trees. But restoring a swamp forest has so many nuances that my research has sort of led me to understand over the years. And the research of countless people before me has also shaped this journey towards learning how to restore a swamp successfully. And it's an ongoing journey. It's something that we're still trying to learn today. So, in order to actually restore a swamp, what do you need to look at? Well, one, you need to look at restoring the water cycle. You need to make sure that adequate water is entering a swamp, even in the driest of years, and adequate water is able to leave the swamp as well to sustain the communities downstream, so that there's not a resource clash happening here. We also need to make sure that diversions of water upstream, so maybe people are putting pipes and extracting water, or the stream itself is diverted through bunds and small check dams so that the water flows into a plantation instead of into the swamp. We as restoration practitioners then have to go in there and say, hey, this is actually counterproductive, because you're diverting all the water, but there's no sustainability. If the water is allowed to flow through the swamp, it's going to stay in this landscape for much longer, and you're going to have water throughout the year, not just in the monsoon when water is flowing on the surface. So that's one aspect of our restoration work. We need to understand the conditions that these trees need to survive and how changing water conditions could impact it. So that's one aspect. The second aspect, of course, is understanding the threats to swamps and understanding in each individual swamp level what is the solution that's needed. There's no blanket solution over here. It's not like planting more trees is going to save a swamp, or preventing a bund is going to save all swamps. Some swamps may have water diversion. Other swamps might be sacred, so people are not even entering these swamps through the to because their gods live there, and people don't want to disturb the gods. So maybe those swamps are doing comparatively better. In other swamps, people have the idea that they can go in and extract resources. Maybe they're easily accessed. So those swamps are facing an issue of their seeds are being collected for making curries and selling in the market as nutmeg, the spice. And as a result, in those swamps, we need a different intervention. We have to go and talk to the people and discuss the alternative livelihood options that they have that don't involve collecting from the swamp and extracting too much from it. And we also need to create the next generation of custodians. So, going to schools has been one of the most enjoyable parts of my work, and talking to kids, uh, exposing them to this landscape that they may know existed but never have seen, because, frankly speaking, swamps are really hard to access. So, talking to kids about this wonderful flooded forest that's right in their backyard that they've never even heard of or seen, but their grandparents may have worshipped once in, or their grandparents may have once entered as children. And this fascination with the natural world and cultivating it at a young age is honestly going to be the reason Myristica swamps exist many years down the road. My work is eventually going to become a book or a thesis. It's going to stay in a shelf somewhere. It's not going to make an actual day to day impact. But educating these children about this ecosystem and helping them care about it and giving them tools and resources to become the custodians of the swamp and the guardians of the swamp is actually what's going to keep these ecosystems surviving and thriving in the many, many decades to come. So that's been one of the absolute joys of this work, and a really satisfying way of pulling all my PhD research together and putting it out there in a conservation product that hopefully benefits more people and benefits these wonderful swamp landscapes in a way that just researching them and publishing academic papers might not be able to do. With that, I'd like to leave you with this stunning image of a swamp in the monsoon. Thank you so much for taking the time to attend this talk. And I'd like to, yeah, I mean, if there are any questions, I'd be happy to take them at this time. Thank you so much.
Yeah, Priya, I mean, that was such an interesting tell all about the Myristica swamps, but I do have a few questions which I wanted to come to you for. In general, for general knowledge, how protected are swamps across the country? I mean, do we know about whether or not there are teams which are actively overseeing the health of swamps?
Yeah, well, that's actually a great question. So, in many parts of the Western Ghats, swamps occur in reserve forests. So, they're under the purview of the
Mm.
forest department. So, what
Okay.
happens is they're managed as a specific type of forest, not necessarily as a type of wetland. So, the type of attention they get, the type of care they get is very geared towards forest management. But it doesn't often account for the fact that we need to maintain the water flows that enter them and maintain the actual flooded nature of these forests. They're not just flooded forests, they're flooded forests, right? So many times the interventions that take place in these by the people who are custodians of the swamp have not really been very effective, especially given the rapid changes in the landscape around. In some parts of the Western Ghats, swamps fall outside of reserve forests, but then they're more so within the community's control or the village's control. So we have village forest committees that would, in that case, oversee the entry of the into the swamp and the use of the swamp. But again, then it becomes a bit more of a reciprocal interaction, where these are the traditional ways we have interacted with these forests, and they are not to be kept isolated from human populations. We interact with them on a daily basis and will continue to do so. So it's not like a regimented set of instructions. You cannot enter the swamp in that case.
Okay.
Whereas forest department manages the swamp, there's a fence around the swamp. There are rules saying that you will be fined for entering. You need a permit to enter, etc. So those are very two
So, do
very
you think
different.
a more structured approach is required? I mean, also when we look at ecotourism, which is one of the things that you address, are there any actions that tourists are making which kind of harm the swamps?
Harm the swamps?
Hmm.
Yeah, definitely, actually. And that's mostly due to litter. Unfortunately, we as humans are extremely messy,
Mm.
and we leave traces behind, or we remove things from nature. I mean, there's the concept of, take only memories, leave behind only footprints. Unfortunately, we
Yes,
leave
yes,
behind a lot more. So sometimes creating trails in these forests works in two ways. It exposes us to them, and maybe that sense of wonder that one person takes from the experience helps them want to come back and help conserve the swamps, but those 10 other people with them might be leaving behind wrappers, or picking up a really interesting looking seed and saying, hey, I'll take this with me and go, and then that's one less
yeah,
seed to stay in the swamp and become a new tree. So
yes.
there's it's a double-edged sword, I think. I mean, knowledge and awareness is extremely important, and ecotourism does that really well, but there's always a flip side to it, I think. Yeah.
No, I can imagine. But also in reference to something that you were saying that when it comes to village committees, when it comes to forest departments that are overlooking swamps, there are these big differences where when it comes to how swamps are treated by the people around them. So you were mentioning that, when people go into these areas and if it's somebody who's just dwelling on the land, it's not so easy for somebody like you to go and tell them, okay, you can't do this, you can do
Yes.
this, and you can make that structure. But why can't that be done? Why can't that be reinforced by the forest department, which is technically meant to overlook that entire matter? I mean, can't we spread more awareness about what to do, what not to do, even for those who live there? Doesn't it also become their responsibility? Because isn't the larger picture about coexisting with nature?
This is all very true, and I think it's also coming though, however, from an urban perspective that we have.
Yes,
So,
absolutely.
yeah. So, for example, like I can go into a swamp area and tell people, "Hey, this is a really important ecological treasure of our country, and we should preserve it. And to preserve it, you need to not do X, Y, Z." The forest
Mm,
department does the same thing very many times. What does that do though?
mm.
It builds a lot of resentment. So telling people what
Okay.
they can't do or telling people that you are excluded from this model of conservation often creates more resentment and harms the effort more than bringing them to the table and asking them for their views and seeing how we can work together. So oftentimes the solution I realized
Yes.
is not clear cut. It's not, hey, you can't access the forest because it matters. So they'll say, well, it matters to us in different ways. Who are you to say
Okay.
that the way it matters to you is different than the is more important than the way it matters to me? How are you more
Okay.
right than? So I think that's where the real difference comes in.
Okay, so it's more about like coming to the same table, being able to converse about it, and trying to figure out more harmonious ways of existing, right?
Yeah, exactly, exactly.
All right, Mr. Ranganathan, thank you so much for joining us. This was such a wonderful and insightful presentation. I'm sure those who were viewing this have learned quite a lot from your presentation. So thank you once again for taking out the time to teach us more about this.
Thank you so much for having me, and it's been my pleasure. So thank you so much.
Absolutely.